I'm a huge fan of pro wrestling. Started watching when I was a kid, still watch it today. When I was a kid, 30 years ago this past week, in fact, Hulk Hogan came out at a pay-per-view event called WCW Bash at the Beach. Now, Hulk Hogan was the superhero of pro wrestling and had been for decades. He reminded children watching to say your prayers, take your vitamins, and believe in yourself, brother. But something changed on that night. Hulk Hogan, for the first time ever, did what is called a heel turn. Now in wrestling, you have good guys and you have bad guys. But the industry terms are babyface and heel. And a heel turn is when someone who has been a good guy surprises everybody and breaks bad. And at WCW Bash at the Beach, it looked like Hulk Hogan was coming to save his longtime friend, Macho Man Randy Savage, yeah. But instead, he dropped a leg on him, and he sided with the bad guys in the ring. He then got on the mic, and he let out all of his grievances with the wrestling industry, with WCW, with the fans. Kids were crying in the stadium. Parents were furious. That night, Hulk Hogan, along with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, formed the NWO and changed the wrestling business forever. Professional wrestling is one of those things that the moment you mention it, someone inevitably replies with, well, you know it's all fake, right? I'm sure a lot of you thought that at me already this morning. As if I'm wandering around under the impression that people regularly just get up from a power bomb off of a ladder into a flaming table. Back in the 80s and 90s, many fans did believe what they were watching was real. And sure, there were always rumors and whispers that it was staged, but most fans wanted to believe, and so they did. The wrestlers themselves played along, doing everything they could to protect kayfabe, which was a term that refers to keeping their in-ring personas alive at all times. If they were a villain on TV, then they stayed a villain in interviews and in public. The illusion was sacred. Now, of course, there were always the unbelievers, the people who took some strange satisfaction in trying to ruin something that everyone enjoyed. But over time, especially with the rise of the internet and social media and smartphones, the truth became impossible to ignore. These days, aside from younger kids, no one truly believes that wrestling is 100% real. We've all seen behind-the-scenes footage and fan-shot videos of wrestlers chatting on the street or in airports, clips from podcasts and social media where the performers break character. The curtain has been pulled back. But when people say wrestling is fake, they usually mean it's scripted. The outcomes are predetermined. The rivalries are dramatized. The blood is usually artificial. And that's true. Pro wrestling is not a legitimate athletic competition. But the word fake makes it sound like nothing real is happening. That couldn't be further from the truth. The matches are planned. There is choreography. But the pain is real. The moves are real. And the risk is absolutely real. These performers put their bodies on the line night after night in ways that rival and often exceed professional contact sports. Injuries like concussions, torn ligaments, even broken bones are unfortunately very common. You cannot fake gravity falling off that ladder and crashing through a flaming table. Just like any great movie or TV series, wrestling lives in the balance between story and surprise. The outcomes may be written ahead of time, but the audience doesn't know what twists are coming or how the drama will unfold. This morning I'm going to talk about wrestling, but in different ways. For instance, wrestling with your own mind. Have you ever had a night where you just couldn't turn your brain off? Not because anything was actively going wrong in that moment, but because you knew something was coming. A hard conversation the next morning, a diagnosis you've been waiting on, a meeting where you might lose your job. And you lie there and your mind runs the same 3 scenarios over and over, and none of them let you sleep. Some of you know exactly the night I'm talking about. Maybe it's not even one specific event. Maybe it's a season, a slow motion 2 a.m. that lasts for months. Here's what I've noticed about those nights. We usually think that by sitting up and worrying about it, the goal is to make that anxious feeling eventually go away. We want peace. We want to feel settled before the morning comes. And when that peace doesn't show up on schedule, we assume something's wrong with our faith, that a good Christian would just feel calm right now. Let God take care of it. And since we don't feel that calm, we must be doing something wrong. We've all absorbed the idea somewhere along the way that spiritual maturity looks like serenity. A calm face, a steady voice. God's got this, without a tremor. And so when we're the opposite of that, when we're lying awake, when we're feeling our gut churn in knots, when we're unable to pray anything more articulate than, please, we quietly conclude that we must not have enough faith. We start managing our doubt like it's something to be embarrassed about, something to hide from people around us, maybe even something to hide from God as if He hasn't noticed. And I want to challenge that today using one of the strangest stories in the whole Bible. Because there's a night right before the scariest day of one man's life where God doesn't show up to calm him down. God shows up to fight him. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 32. And it's going to be up on the screen too. And this is about Jacob. On the night before, he's about to face his brother Esau, the brother that he cheated out of a birthright and a blessing, the brother who once swore he'd kill him. Jacob hasn't seen Esau in 20 years, and now Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men behind him. And Jacob has no idea if that is a welcoming party or an army. So the night before, he sends his family and everything he owns across the river ahead of him, and Jacob is left alone. And we start in verse 22. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched Jacob's hip socket at the sinew of the thigh. Pretty strange passage, huh? There's a lot going on in those 11 verses, and honestly, if you read it again, it gets stranger every time. A man who Jacob later says was God himself shows up in the dark and wrestles him. Not comforts him, not answers his prayer, wrestles him all night. And when the stranger can't win, he doesn't overpower Jacob. He just wounds him and then asks to be let go. And Jacob, hip out of socket, in the worst pain of his life, says, "No, I will not let you go unless you bless me." That is one of the boldest sentences in the entire Bible. And it's said by a man who is now losing a fight against God, as God has just proven he can severely injure Jacob simply with a tap. Think about the strangeness of this setup for a second. This is Almighty God. He could end this match in half a second if he wanted to. He doesn't need to wrestle all night to prove that he's stronger than Jacob. That was never in question. So why does this fight go on for hours? Why does God let it drag toward daybreak instead of just ending it? Well, this fight wasn't God struggling to win. I think this is God patiently letting Jacob do something Jacob has never done before in his entire life. Hold on to something with his bare hands instead of scheming his way around it. Here's what I think is happening. Jacob has spent his entire life running and scheming. He tricked his father into giving him the blessing meant for his older brother. He cheated Esau out of his birthright over a bowl of stew. He outmaneuvered his father-in-law Laban for 20 years, building flocks and wealth through cleverness and manipulation more than his honest labor. Jacob's whole strategy for getting what he wanted was always the same. Be clever enough, be fast enough, be sneaky enough, and you'll come out ahead. And the strategy worked in a sense. Jacob left Laban with a wealthy man with 2 wives, 11 sons, and enough livestock to make him rich by any standard of his day. But it never actually settled anything inside him. Notice even here, right before this wrestling match, his first instinct is still to scheme. He sends gifts ahead in waves to soften up Esau. He divides his camp into 2 groups so that if Esau attacks one, the other might survive. He's still playing the angles right up until the moment he's alone in the dark and the angles have run out. Because he's about to meet the one person his cleverness can't fix, a brother with 2 decades of grudge and a 400-man platoon behind him. And for the first time in the story, there's no scheme available to Jacob. He can't out-negotiate this one. He can't send enough goats to make this right. There's no version of clever Jacob that survives this reunion on its own merits. And so God meets him alone in the dark the night before. And instead of removing the struggle, God becomes the struggle. And I think that's actually the mercy in this story. Even though it doesn't look like mercy at first, Jacob had never had to hold on to anything with his bare hands before. He'd always found a clever way around holding on. This is the first time in his life he can't slip out of something. He has to grip it and refuse to let go. And that's exactly what changes his name. Not Jacob, the guy who finally relaxed. Israel, one who has wrestled with God and prevailed. The new name is not reward for calm. It's a reward for not letting go. There's a strange modern echo of this in professional wrestling. Last year, John Cena, that guy, you know who I'm talking about. After 2 decades as WWE's most consistent good guy, shocked everybody by turning on Cody Rhodes, a heel turn, and aligning himself with the villain, chasing one more championship at the expense of everything he'd built his career on. And for months, the man who'd spent 20 years telling kids to never give up was doing the opposite. And what finally snapped him out of it wasn't a twist of fate, it was Cody, the very man he betrayed, reminding Cena of who he actually was and what his career had actually been worth. That confrontation is what turned him back. Strip away the theatrics, and there's something familiar in that. Sometimes we drift so far from who we are that it takes someone else holding up a mirror before we can say our own name again. That's almost exactly what happens to Jacob in the dark. Before he gets his new name, the stranger makes him say his old one out loud. What is your name? Jacob. The deceiver has to speak his own name before he can be renamed. You can't get free of who you've become until you're honest about who you've been. And Jacob isn't an outlier. This kind of raw, unresolved wrestling with God shows up all over the Bible, and I think it's worth sitting with for a minute because it means this isn't a strange side note. It is woven through the whole story. Job argues with God for 30-some chapters, demands an explanation, gets no tidy answer. And God actually tells Job's friends, the ones with the clean theology and the polished answers, that they are wrong and Job was right in his struggling, in his anger. Habakkuk opens his entire book by essentially shouting at God about injustice. How long, Lord, will you let evil win? Elijah, fresh off calling down fire from heaven in front of the whole nation, collapses under a tree and asks God to just let him die. And God's response isn't a rebuke. It's a meal and a nap and a gentle whisper. A third of the Psalms are laments, raw, sometimes angry, sometimes ending with no resolution at all. Psalm 88 is maybe the darkest of them. It ends on the word darkness with no bright turn at the close. Paul begs God 3 separate times to remove his thorn in the flesh, and God's answer isn't removal, it's, my grace is sufficient for you, which is a real answer, but not the one Paul asked for. And Jesus himself, the night before his own hardest day, sweats drops of blood in the garden, asking God 3 times if there is another way. So if wrestling with God disqualifies someone from faith, it would disqualify Job, Habakkuk, Elijah, David, Paul, Jesus himself. But that is not a list of spiritual failures. That's most of the Bible's most trusted voices. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying that struggling with God is the goal, or that doubt is somehow more spiritual than trust. That's not it. What I am saying is this: wrestling with God is not evidence that your faith has failed. For some of you, wrestling is the most honest form of faith you've got left. You've read the verses about peace that surpasses all understanding, and you feel like a failure because you don't have it. Not tonight, not this year, not through this diagnosis, this marriage, this loss, and you think that the wrestling itself means that you're doing this wrong. Jacob's story says otherwise. He walked away with a new name and God's blessing, and he got there by refusing to let go, not by calming down. Faith isn't the absence of struggle. Sometimes faith is what the struggle looks like when you refuse to walk away from the one you're struggling with. There's a difference between wrestling with God and walking away from him, and it's a difference that matters more than almost anything else in this room. Jacob never let go of the man he was fighting. That's the whole key to this story. He fought with everything he had, and he never once ran. So let me land on 3 things for you today. Point number 1 is that God meets you in the dark, not just in the comfortable moments. Notice where this happens. It's not at an altar. It's not in a worship service, not surrounded by people. Jacob is alone at night, at his most exposed, the night before the scariest day of his life, and that is exactly where God shows up. I read once about the mathematician and philosopher Pascal. Everyone knows Pascal from math class. Pascal's triangle, Pascal's wager. What most people don't know is that after he died, a servant found something sewn into the lining of his coat. A small piece of parchment that had been worn soft from being carried and then re-sewn into coat after coat for years. And on it, Pascal had written down the details of a single overwhelming encounter with God that he experienced late one night. The date, even the hour. He never told anyone about it while he was alive. He just carried the memory of that night literally stitched against his chest for the rest of his life. That's not a man who met God in a lecture hall surrounded by admirers. That's a man who met God alone at night and was never the same. Think about a hospital waiting room at 3 a.m., the kind where you're the only one awake. The vending machine hum is the loudest thing in the building, and you're waiting on news you can't control. Chaplains who work night shifts will tell you that that is where some of the most honest conversations with God happen in the whole building. Not in the chapel down the hall with the soft lighting and the tissue boxes arranged just so on every row. In the hallway at 3 a.m., when nobody's performing anything for anybody. If you're in a season where God feels distant during the day, during the normal stuff, in the meetings and the routines, but you keep having these 2 a.m. moments where it's just you and your fear and your questions, I want to suggest something. That might not be God's absence. You might be the least alone you've ever been in that moment. That might be exactly where He's chosen to meet you. The dark isn't where God stops showing up. It's often where He shows up the most, because it's where we stop performing. Point number 2. Holding on, even while you're losing, is still faith. Jacob is losing this fight. His hip is now dislocated. He is in genuine physical agony. And in that condition, he says the boldest thing in the whole story: I will not let you go unless you bless me. He does not win by strength. He wins by refusing to release his grip. There's a story about a college football player named Chris Norton, who was paralyzed from the chest down during a tackle in a game in 2010. Doctors told him that there was a 3% chance he'd ever regain any significant motor function below his neck. Most people, hearing odds like that, would give in, let go, accept the diagnosis, and just move forward from there. Norton didn't release his grip on the goal. He spent years in daily grinding physical therapy, often making progress so small it was nearly invisible day to day. 7 years later, he stood up out of his wheelchair and, with the help of a walker and his fiancée at his side, walked across the stage at his college graduation. He didn't win the fight quickly, and for a long time it looked like he was losing it. What changed his story wasn't a single dramatic moment of strength. It was refusing day after day to let go. There's another version of this same idea again in wrestling. Cody Rhodes, the one from earlier, spent years building toward a single WrestleMania moment in 2023, hoping to finish a story that his own father, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, baby, had never been able to accomplish, which was winning the WWE World Heavyweight Championship. By the time the match arrived, it felt like the whole thing had been written in the stars for him to beat Roman Reigns, a tyrannical villain who had held the title and the company in his grip for years at this point. Everybody was expecting Cody to win that night at WrestleMania, the granddaddy of them all, the show of shows, the biggest night of wrestling every year, where the goal is always to send the crowd home happy. But Cody lost. He lost clean on the biggest stage there is. The match everyone was sure was his. If you'd asked anyone that night, the story looked over, just not the way anybody expected. And he didn't get a shortcut back. He spent the next full year working his way back up with no guarantee he'd get another shot at all. It took another 12 months before he got back to that stage, and only then, after the gauntlet had been thrown in his path, did he win. The moment that had looked like the finish line turned out to only be the middle of the story. And there was no way to skip the year of holding on in between that first match and that last match. These are fictional stories, I get it. But they tell real human tales. I think about this in smaller ways too. Anybody who's ever tried to save a marriage that seemed by every outward measure to be failing, the counseling that didn't seem to be working yet, the hard conversations that kept circling back to the same wound, knows what it feels like to hold on to something while it feels like you're losing. Nobody throws you a parade for that kind of holding on. There's no moment where anyone hands you a trophy for the year that you didn't quit. There's no title belt at the end of a spiritual wrestling match with God. But Jacob's blessing didn't come at the moment he started winning. It came at the moment he refused to stop holding on in the middle of losing. Some of you have been wrestling with the same thing for years: a bad relationship, an addiction, a grief, a question about whether God is even paying attention. And it feels like you're losing your hips out of socket, so to speak. And here's what Jacob's story says to that. You don't have to be winning the fight for your faith to be real. You just have to keep holding on until the blessing comes. And some blessings only show up for people who refuse to walk away first. Point 3. You can leave marked and blessed at the same time. This is a part of the story that I think gets skipped over the fastest, and it might be the most important part. Jacob gets his new name. He gets that blessing that he sought. He even says he saw God face to face and lived. And then, in the very next verse, he limps away permanently. Verse 31 says the sun rose on him as he passed by, limping because of his hip. The text even notes that Israel had a dietary practice for generations afterward tied to this exact wound. A whole nation for centuries quietly remembered one man's limp every time they prepared a meal. The blessing didn't erase the limp. They coexisted for the rest of his life. We tend to want our God stories to resolve cleanly. The wound goes away, the scar disappears, and it's like the hard season never happened at all. But that's not what happened to Jacob, and it's not usually what happens to us either. Corrie ten Boom survived a Nazi concentration camp where her sister died, and she carried that memory and that loss for the rest of her life. And she still became someone who taught the world about forgiveness, who was received by kings and prime ministers, whose ministry outlived her by decades. The wound didn't get edited out of the story so the blessing could fit. They both stayed side by side for the rest of her life. Think about it this way too. Nobody looks at a retired athlete's surgical scars and says that those scars disqualify the championship. The scars and the trophy sit on the same metaphorical shelf. Nobody's confused about which one is the real story because they're both the real story. If you're carrying a limp right now, a scar or a diagnosis, a loss, a consequence that you're struggling to live with, I want you to hear this clearly. God is not waiting for that limp to disappear before he blesses you. Jacob walked toward the rest of his life limping and renamed in the same breath. Your wound and your blessing are allowed to coexist. It's not a lesser version of God's favor. For Jacob, it was the proof of it. It can be for us too. I'm not a pastor. I wouldn't even say I'm a preacher, really. I'm a speaker, a guest speaker. I'm a storyteller. And when I'm given the opportunity to fill this pulpit, I don't do it out of some sense of entitlement or out of a belief that I belong here. I do it because I have wrestled with God more times than I can count. And I know that my personal experiences are not unique to me. In any sense, every message I've given has been a testimony of sorts, sharing the lessons I've learned as I've struggled with these same issues. And most of the time, Those struggles are in the past. However, this struggle, this one comes up all the time. I feel like I am constantly wrestling with doubt, wrestling with fear, wrestling with motivation, wrestling with anger, wrestling with contentment, wrestling with parenthood. And I hear myself saying in my head, you weren't cut out for this. You'll never be the husband or the father that you should be. You'll never get your bad habits under control. You deserve to be miserable. And honestly, there might be some truth to that. I really am not cut out for this. I've always been striving, and I always will be striving, to be a better husband and a better father. I've been dealing with most of my bad habits, chief among them being gluttony, my entire life, almost 40 years. I'm 40 years old, but I haven't been struggling with that. Gluttony when I was 4, that didn't count. I've been struggling with it so long at this point, I'm not convinced I'll ever truly beat it. It might just be something I wrestle with for the rest of my life. And when it comes to what I deserve, I think the Bible's pretty clear about that for all of us. And in the last few months, as worries and struggles and changes and challenges have been compounding around me, I'm finding myself laying awake or walking in a daze or staring out into the void as my mind races through a tangled knot of prayers and laments and praises and fears and memories of times God has provided and memories of times when I failed, and so on and so forth, until all I can manage to do is heave a heavy sigh in the direction of God and hold on to this faith with all of my strength and refuse to let it go, because I know that God will bless my efforts. Even if I end up limping away from the encounter, God will bless me. Even if the story takes longer to finish than I expect, God will bless me. Even if I've spent a season forgetting who I was made to be, God will ask my name, and God will remind me who I am and who He made me to be, and God will bless me. This kind of faith isn't fake. It's scripted. God knows the twists and the turns coming. And I, like a wrestling fan, have to wait and watch intently for it all to play out. So when I'm struggling, I will wrestle with God until daybreak. I will wrestle for days on end, but I will never walk away or give up until my story is finished. I've talked a lot about wrestling this morning, and I thank you for indulging me. But I want to come full circle. I began talking to you about Hulk Hogan's heel turn, when he abandoned his decades-long good guy persona and became Hollywood Hulk Hogan, the guy who abandoned his fans and only really cared about himself, money, and power. But the heel turn was not the end of the story. A few years later, WWE bought out WCW. Two rival promotions, one finally won the battle. And in 2002, Hollywood Hulk Hogan returned to face The Rock. Rocky Maivia. You've seen him in movies. At WrestleMania. And something magical happened that night. And what makes it magical is that it was not scripted. It was not pre-written. It was not the plan at all. It was not fake in any sense of the word. When bad guy Hulk Hogan walked into the ring at WrestleMania 18 and stood face to face with The Rock, the massive crowd went nuts, but they were mostly cheering for Hogan. The crowd didn't care that Hulk Hogan was the bad guy in the story. They were overjoyed that he was back in the WWE, the company where he got his start. They cheered the return of their hero, even if technically they were supposed to boo him. The Rock and Hulk Hogan both realized what was happening in that moment and had to decide on the fly that Hulk Hogan would have a face turn in this match. And so, the plan changed, the choreography changed in the moment. Hogan didn't do anything underhanded like a villain would do. He didn't do any classic bad guy shenanigans. He did all of the classic moves and poses that he's known for. And the crowd ate it up. Because this was never the plan, Hogan had to scramble like mad to find his old red and yellow wrestling gear for TV the next night, so he could come home to a hero's welcome. Hollywood Hulk Hogan had planned to continue being his underhanded, devious, self-centered persona, but an outside force made him reevaluate who he was and even changed his name by dropping the Hollywood. The fans were just happy he was home. In this battle with God, Jacob had his own face-turn moment. He realized that he had not been the man God wanted him to be, and this was his opportunity to make things right. The next day, Jacob finally faced his brother Esau. And instead of the violent confrontation he worried about, Jacob had feared Esau. Esau instead ran up to him, threw his arms around his neck, and wept. And the two brothers reconciled, and Esau offered to escort Jacob through the region. He was just happy to see him again. Jacob politely declined Esau's escort and eventually settled near the city of Shechem, where he purchased a plot of land and built an altar. And while Jacob faced many more trials and challenges throughout his life, he lived the rest of his days doing his best to live up to his new name. He made peace with his family, stopped running, and trusted in God. So here's where I want to land this morning. If you're in a wrestling match with God right now over a decision, diagnosis, doubt, a grief that you can't make sense of, I'm not going to tell you to stop wrestling and just relax. Jacob didn't get his blessing by chilling out. He got it by holding on until daybreak. Bring your whole fight to God. Don't sanitize it. Don't perform peace that you don't have. Hold on the way Jacob held on. Through the pain, past the point where it makes sense to keep holding on. And trust that daybreak comes, even when you're left limping into it. And if you're sitting here today thinking that your faith must be weak because you're still in the middle of the fight, please forget that idea. The fight itself was never the sign of a weak faith. Letting go would have been. Jacob is remembered forever, not as a man who never struggled, but as the man who wrestled with God and did not let go.